Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me. My name is Janine and I am a psychologist and the Director of Trauma Services at Mental Health Partners in Boulder County. And thank you for your devotion to recovery and to healing for maybe yourself and for people you serve. So I am here to talk about that connection that I'm guessing all of you know intuitively through your experience, through your education, about the connection between trauma and substance use. And I want to start with a vignette, a little story of a client. Names are changed to protect confidentiality, but just begin with grounding ourselves in this experience. So when Julian was about 10 years old, his parents separated after a particularly bad domestic violence episode. A year later, he was left to be babysat by the mother's then ex-boyfriend. And the boyfriend, Jack, gave little Julian a joint. The little boy said, "It made me happy. It made me feel like everything is okay. I started stealing their drugs after that." Julian was later caught by the boyfriend and then subsequently locked in the closet for 2 days as a punishment for getting into their stuff. And Julian says, after that, I guess part of me was changed. I hated the world and I hated myself. And here it is, right? Here is the beginning of some of the link between traumatic stress and substance use. I mean, here, in a not uncommon situation, there was a traumatic situation that kind of started things off with some family instability with the domestic violence. And then it was another member of the child's kind of network that introduced the substance use, okay? And who knows, maybe the boyfriend, we don't know, but maybe the boyfriend also had his own trauma, and that's why the boyfriend was even using substances in the first place, right? So we start to see kind of a complicated fabric, interweaving trauma with substance use. And by Julian's admission, it made him feel like everything was okay. It was a way to cope with things that were quite devastating in his world. So we could go on about the prevalence and the link between substance and trauma abuse, but really, I mean, the 65% of all clients in substance abuse treatment report some kind of childhood abuse. Ann Noonan, who just spoke before me, so Ann and I used to work together in Boulder County, and Ann was directing kind of an intensive outpatient substance abuse women's program at the time. And I said, Ann, how many of those women would you say have a trauma history? And without hesitating, she's like 100%. Now, national statistics say 90% of women, but I think it's probably underreported. I think probably Ann's data is closer to true. Now, and then trauma, we know how pervasive that is. And again, probably often underreported, in that 1 in 4 children and adolescents in the United States experience at least one traumatic event before age 16. That's a lot. And that's a lot that experience substance abuse trauma young. We'll talk about substance abuse in a minute. And then 59% of young people with PTSD start using young. Now, Ann quoted a statistic about the use when somebody starts using alcohol young. I don't know the research about this, but I would guess that if people start also using other substances, marijuana, other drugs young, the more potential for addiction, okay? And we certainly saw that in the case scenario with Julian. And then women with PTSD were 2.5 more likely to meet criteria for alcohol use and dependence, and 4.5 times more likely to meet criteria for drug use dependence than non-PTSD people. So these two issues are not distant cousins. They're very close siblings. Okay, they often go together. And if we don't look for that connection, we miss things on one end or the other. We'll talk more about that. So first, let me back up and let me talk a little bit about traumatic stress, and just to make sure we're grounded and on the same page with how we think about that. So there's two broad kinds of categories of trauma. One that we call shock trauma, and that might be the things we most readily think of, right? These big events that are scary and sudden and threatening, like a sexual assault, domestic violence, being part of a natural disaster, right? Things that are big and kind of life-shattering. Where there's threat to the person's life, okay? And then after the event, it differs from normal stress because a person might have difficulty bringing the body back into balance, right? If we experience normal stress, like bad traffic on I-25, right, coming up here, we can usually rebalance, regroup, eat our lunch, and kind of get it back together somewhat quickly, okay? Traumatic stress bumps the body's nervous system in a way that it's hard to bring back to balance quickly or easily, sometimes if at all, without proper intervention. But I really want us to think about what's called developmental trauma. And these are not these big, there's often not one event that is life-shattering or necessarily even physically life-threatening, okay? It could be something like growing up with an alcoholic parent. There may or may not be some other shock traumas in that developmental trajectory, but really it's a pattern of what we call chronic misattunement between the parent or the caregiver and the child. So there's these almost little injuries that happen bit by bit that lead to a traumatic childhood experience. Does that make sense? So it could be as simple as the caregiver is intoxicated or high, and the kid's coming home from school and the parent is so checked out to be able to even talk about what happened that day or what the kid might need for their science project that week. And it's that level of misattunement to the child's needs physically or emotionally over time that is developmental trauma. So those are the things that maybe we or our clients minimize. It was no big deal, right? And so we don't think of it as trauma, but it absolutely is. So as I said then, what happens is survivors of trauma start to try to manage their disrupted nervous system. If you want to hear more about this, I'm talking later in the next workshop about how it disrupts, why it disrupts, and how to get it undisrupted. They use substances to try to manage, to try to cope, right? And then if you look at it on the flip side, okay, it's awfully hard with people who then have substance use disorders to stop using if they have an underlying trauma and they're actively experiencing PTS-like symptoms. Does that make sense? So for example, if somebody is experiencing chronic flashbacks or intrusive memory of the trauma, or a hypervigilant response, being on edge or irritable, okay? Very, very common responses to trauma. It's really hard to say, hey, okay, we got to look at decreasing your substance use when that might be the only thing that is managing those symptoms. Now, albeit, in a problematic way long term. But how do you get somebody to give that up when then all those symptoms being present could be not good for them? Okay? Yeah. So it's interesting, here's another layer of the connection, is that substance use could precede also trauma exposure. So for example, if somebody is driving after using alcohol, there might be higher likelihood that they're in some kind of accident, or they have legal consequences that could lead to maybe incarceration that could come with its own set of trauma, right? So sometimes substance use actually can come before trauma, or substance use could come after trauma, like we just spoke of. So, as I said, I'll dive into this a little deeper in a little bit, but traumatic stress symptoms really start appearing when the energy that is activated to mobilize after a trauma gets stuck in the body. So what do I mean by that? I mean that if someone is under threat, okay, maybe they're being sexually abused, or there's domestic violence, there's adrenaline, epinephrine, neuroepinephrine, different stress hormones that get activated to be able to deal, cope, fight out of the situation, whatever it is. Okay, that's a good thing, but only if one actually fights, deals, and copes. If somebody doesn't and they go into what's known more as a freeze response, where maybe they do nothing, maybe they stay in the situation for whatever reason, lots of good reasons, all those stress hormones stay stuck in the body. So people can either get stuck on, where they might have a lot of anxiety, irritation, difficulty sleeping, right? Or sometimes people can get stuck off, which means somebody's flat, numb, dissociated, right? Checked out. So let's think about substances. What do you think helps? What substance do you think helps when somebody is stuck on, when their nervous system is on and elevated? What helps? Alcohol, marijuana, right? Again, short-term fixes to kind of deal with that stuck-onness. What helps when somebody's stuck off, flat, numb? Meth. Exactly. And there's probably other ones too, but that's a broad brushstroke. So you can see that sometimes it's an attempt for people to solve a problem, right, in their biochemistry that has really dangerous and potentially lethal consequences. And these are just there's other kind of adaptations of things people try to do to cope with the trauma. I'm sure you've worked with people who have done self-harm, like cutting or burning, or acted out sexually, or dissociated, right? Dissociating is highly adaptive. It helps one not fully take in what's happening, right? It's protecting in their brain, their body, from what they're facing. So all of these things are adaptations to the initial trauma, and substance abuse is probably the most common adaptation to the trauma. Okay? How many of you are familiar with the ACE study, Adverse Childhood Experiences Study? Okay, okay, so maybe about a third of the room. So this might be review for some of you, but it's important. So in San Diego County, California, one of the largest studies on childhood maltreatment was done. 17,000 people of Kaiser Permanente insurance, right? They were members of Kaiser. And they were surveyed on these questions that assessed their childhood and what they experienced as children. And some of the questions, this is a this is 7 out of the 10, but have you ever had current physical abuse or severe or physical abuse, emotional abuse? Did you grow up in a household with an alcoholic or a drug user? Did you witness your mother being treated violently? Were both biological parents not present? So you get the sense. And then you took the survey and you got an ACE score, adverse childhood experience. Your ACE score was 0 to 10, okay? And keep in mind the sample size, right? This was people with health insurance in a pretty affluent, relatively affluent, pretty racially diverse, but socioeconomic. I mean, people had private insurance, right? So it was kind of middle to kind of above medium income. And then what they did is they measured stuff on these ACEs, and particularly the relationship with substance abuse. And again, the small words on this chart isn't important, but what I want you to just note is the graph. So on the x-axis, the parallel axis to the ground, is ever had a drug problem. So the higher the ACE, which was on the left, the y-axis, the more likely of having a drug problem, ever addicted to drugs, ever injected drugs. Look at that difference. If somebody had an ACE score of, let's say, 0 or 1, the chances of doing intravenous drug use is tiny. But you get up to start having ACE scores, about 4, and that goes way up. So link between child maltreatment and traumatic stress and drug use. Same with alcohol, very similar. I'm always fascinated by this graph. So this is like early initiation of alcohol is the first one. Problem with alcohol use, that you yourself become alcoholic. And then look at this one, marry an alcoholic is through the roof right? And that makes some sense to me too. I don't have enough time in this forum, we can break it down over there. But so this is one of my favorite quotes that came out of the ACE study, and it was done by Vincent Folletti, who was one of the doctors who was the primary investigator on the topic, and I loved it. It says, a male child with an ACE score of 6 has a 4,600% increase in the likelihood of later using intravenous drugs. Might heroin then be used for relief of profound anguish dating back to childhood experiences? Might it be the best coping device that one can find? So it just takes, in my field, even I've been doing this work for 25 years, I read a quote like that and it regrounds me. It recenters me into the fact that people aren't using heroin all the time because they're bad people who, just don't have a clue and they want to ruin themselves and their families. It's usually to adapt to some pretty horrific things that they were exposed to. And I think if we have this frame, we'll do okay in our treatment, right? And for the sake of time, let me just skip ahead to talk about, how am I doing on time? I'm good? Okay. I'm not good. I'm done. Okay. All right, I didn't see that. Sorry. It's okay. Okay. I thought I was good. I could keep going. Okay. So let me just wrap up by saying this. Effective treatment. Old school used to say, oh, well, someone has to stop using substances before we can go in and treat the trauma. No. Okay? No. They need to be treated at the same time. And you can't just go to a normal counselor who's a generalist in psychotherapy. It has to be someone who knows how to use evidence-based or evidence-informed trauma-focused treatment, right? And then work both at the same time, the substance use and the trauma and the substance abuse. So given that I'm out of time, I'll lead you with this quote. Addiction is a secondary problem that comes out of a primary problem. So when we put all the emphasis on the secondary problem but don't pay attention to the primary one, how can we possibly succeed? Gabor Mate. So we'll succeed though, because now you know you're ready. And thank you so much for your attention. And sorry I went a little over. I didn't see. Okay.